Currently, he is serving a second term with Lok Sabha as a member of parliament representing the Thiruvananthapuram constituency, and he is also the chairman of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs. During his nearly 3-decade-long prior career at the United Nations, he served as a peacekeeper, refugee worker, and an administrator at the highest levels, serving as an Undersecretary General during Kofi Annan's leadership of the organization. Dr. Tharoor is also an award-winning author of over 15 books of both fiction and nonfiction. For millennials, Dr. Tharoor uniquely inspires us to use our energy, spirit, and idealism to promote innovation and transformation in the spaces we enter. Without further ado, we welcome Dr. Shashi Tharoor to the stage.
Thank you for that kindness. There are so many microphones here, I'm not sure which one I should be speaking into. I guess this is it, right? Yeah, am I audible at the back and all that? Wonderful. Well, great to see you all. I'm delighted to be here at Barnard and at one of the best-known universities in the world, and one from which my son had graduated, rather post-graduated, or whatever the word is. Got a master's in Columbia a few years ago. The topic that I'm going to address goes a little beyond South Asia, but yet is related to it. It's India in today's networked world. And I know that it's sort of a curtain raiser for your South Asian Millennials conference, though unfortunately I won't be able to stay to be a part of that. But I'm very pleased that this may help, shall we say, broaden the scope of our appreciation of South Asia's place in the world before you all get into tackling some of the more specific details with the other speakers when that conference gets underway. But in 2012, I wrote a book called Pax Indica, India and the World of the 21st Century. And many people immediately and perhaps understandably mistook the title for some sort of Indian arrogance. You know, our answer to Pax Britannica and Pax Americana, Pax Romana, all this world domination stuff. And actually, what I took pains to explain was I didn't actually mean that at all. It was what I felt would be a critical role that India had to play in what is increasingly becoming a cooperative network system in our multipolar world. So the idea of Pax Indica to me was not about India as a future world leader or even as an ex-superpower, which is the kind of term that some Indian commentators were actually using a few years ago. It occasioned one of my less pleasant controversies when I said, how can we be a superpower when we are still super poor? Which didn't get me a very good press, as you can imagine. But I'm getting used to that of late, so it's all right. So what I wanted to talk about instead in the idea of Pax Indica was India's role in shaping the emerging global framework, which is really what will define international relations and world politics in the 21st century. But since I'm standing on a university podium and with this very impressive audience overwhelmingly made up of students, I felt I had to give you some points that you could take away from here. And I was just mulling this and remembering that a century ago, at the time of the First World War, President Woodrow Wilson had come up with 14 points to end the World War, right? And the French president of the day, Clemenceau, said 14 points, even the good Lord only needed 10. So, having no aspirations to either emulate Wilson or the good Lord, I shall try and stop at 9. Let me give you 9 points about India, the network world, and then I'd be very happy to take questions, not just on anything that I say in my talk, but on anything else that may be of interest to all of you, going beyond what I've addressed today. So, first, there's no escaping globalization. You know, when I first came to the US as a graduate student, before any of you were even a gleam in your parents' eyes, way back in 1975, the word globalization didn't exist, or anyway, no one was using it. But today, of course, there's no escaping it. In many ways, I'm conscious that it's become a bit of a commonplace. Our most routine headlines reek of references to globalization. And how widespread it struck me was when we had the headlines a few years ago about the tragic death, the 10th anniversary of the tragic death of Princess Diana. Don't stop me if you've heard this before, because I have had a habit of inflicting this on a few audiences. But it's such a perfect example. You might say, what has this got to do with globalization? Well, think of it this way. An English princess with a Welsh title leaves a French hotel with an Egyptian companion who has supplanted a Pakistani. She gets into a German car with a Dutch engine and is driven by a Belgian chauffeur full of Scottish whiskey. They are chased by Italian paparazzi on Japanese scooters, motorcycles, into a Swiss-built tunnel where they crash. A rescue is briefly attempted by an American doctor using Brazilian medicines, and the whole story is being told to New York by an Indian member of parliament from Tirunelveli. That's globalization. So, but the fact is that even in a country like India, this has become true. And it's even a country like India because for us, self-reliance and economic self-sufficiency were a mantra for more than 4 decades after independence. And there were real doubts as to whether our country should open itself further to the world economy. Whereas in America, where we're all living now, most people axiomatically associate capitalism with freedom. India's nationalists axiomatically associated capitalism with slavery. Why? Because the British East India Company had come to trade and stayed on to rule. So our nationalists were reflexively suspicious of every foreigner with a briefcase, because the assumption was he had to be part of the thin end of a new imperial wedge. They say they're coming to trade and invest. The whisper went, so to Uche. But in fact, what they really want to do is to rule us. Because that was our historical experience, and it only goes to prove that one of the lessons you learn from history is that history can sometimes teach you the wrong lessons. What do? We actually ended up, instead of integrating India into the global capitalist system, as only a handful of post-colonial countries like Singapore actually chose to do, we subtracted India from the global trading system and the global investment system because our leaders were convinced that the political independence they had fought so long and hard for could only be guaranteed through economic independence. And the result was that we spent 45 years with businessmen essentially pushed to the side and bureaucrats on the commanding heights of the economy. And in these first 4.5 decades after independence, we were essentially subsidizing unproductivity, regulating stagnation, and trying to distribute poverty. So it's important to understand the extent of the paradigm shift that was needed for a country like India to give up the cherished assumptions of its independence movement and chart a new course. It took a world-class financial crisis in 1991 when we actually had to ship our physical reserves of gold to London to stand collateral for an IMF loan. And for those of you of Indian origin who know the place of gold in some family's sense of their honor, practically, shipping your gold off to a foreign country, that was London of all places, really sent a shock through the system. And it took that to prompt India to change course. Our foreign finance minister of the day, later Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, standing up in his famous budget speech in Parliament, paraphrasing Victor Hugo to say, "There is no power on earth that can stop an idea whose time has come." And the idea whose time had come was the liberalization and opening up of the Indian economy, its integration into the world of globalization. And indeed, this has now become, as I said, truly irreversible, because in the 25 years since Manmohan Singh's speech, we've had governments of every conceivable political stripe. Every single Indian political party has been involved in government, either as a member of a coalition government or as supporting one from the outside. And none of them has reversed the achievements of liberalization or moved to reduce the global connectedness of the Indian economy. And I tell you this in some detail because for someone of my generation, the transformation is truly significant. I grew up in India where foreign goods were essentially unavailable. if some of you here are Indian American, your parents must recall how going back to India with suitcases full of the most routine consumer goods made them sort of get received as if they were Santa Claus descending upon them. Gosh, Pop-Tarts! The fact is that we really were, we had, our cars were made in India, our safety pins were made in India, our shirts were made in India, our jeans were ripped off in India. They simply, self-reliance was very much a thing. And today, to be a young person in India can mean waking up to an alarm clock made in China, dialing a cup of tea from leaves first planted by the British, donning jeans actually designed in America, taking a Japanese scooter or a Korean car to an Indian college, where your textbooks, of course, would be printed on German invented technology on paper, first popped in Sweden. You might call your friends on a Finnish or Taiwanese mobile phone these days, because the poor old Nokia isn't quite doing as well as it used to. So the Taiwanese mobile phone is more likely than the Finnish one. And you might invite them to an Italian pizza, or what you think of as an Indian meal, featuring naan that came to us from Persia, tandoori chicken taught to us by rulers from Uzbekistan, and aloo and hari mirch, potatoes and green chilies, that didn't exist in India till 400 years ago when they came to us from Latin America. And the most desi thing of all, of course, is suspicion of anything foreign. But in such a world, issues that once seemed so far away are very much in your backyard. What happens in East Asia, in South Africa, whether it's protectionist politics, deforestation, desertification, the Zika virus, the fight against AIDS, can affect your lives where you live here in North Africa. And North America. Jet lag does hit you sometimes. And your choices anywhere, what you buy, how you vote, can resound far away. As someone once said about water pollution, we all live downstream. We are all interconnected, and we can no longer afford the luxury of not thinking about the rest of the planet in anything we do. Second, there is a paradox at the heart of this globalized new world. When we think about the forces of globalization irresistibly transforming the world, we think basically of the information technology revolution that brings to our breakfast tables and our living rooms and our computers and our mobile phones snippets of information and glimpses of events from every corner of the globe. These are what one might call the forces of convergence, which have made the world one village, one market, one audience. But the opposite also exists. We have to think about the changes that terrorism and conflict have also wrought in the world. The aftermath of 9/11 in this city, and the war on terror that followed, 26/11 in Mumbai, and the heightened awareness of terror that followed that, the rise in violent manifestations of intolerance in many, many places, and of course the wars in Iraq and in Syria, in Yemen, and elsewhere. These are the forces of disruption that threaten to create new divisions between haves and have-nots, between North and South, between people of different creeds and cultures and religions. In other words, the very forces that through globalization are pulling us together are at the very same time, through international terrorism, are driving us apart. This, in many ways, is the defining paradox of our age, and living with this paradox is at the heart of the challenges of our brave new world. Third, however, globalization does not flow only in one direction. And this is not a new insight, because when the Indian industrialist Jamshedji Tata was denied admission 120 years ago to Pike's Hotel in Bombay at the peak of the British Empire, he built a larger, grander, more opulent hotel that was open to Indians, unlike Pike's. Pike's had the famous sign saying, "Indians and dogs not allowed," the Taj Mahal Hotel. Now the Taj is today considered one of the finest hotels in the world, whereas Pike's has long since closed. I don't know where the dogs are going, but Pike's is closed. So when the same Mr. Tata set up India's first ever steel mill back in 1905 in the face of implacable British hostility. A senior imperial official sneered that he would personally eat every ounce of steel that an Indian was capable of producing. I only regret that he didn't live long enough to see the descendants of the same Mr. Tata acquire the remnants of British steel when they bought Chorus a few years ago. Might have given him a bad case of indigestion. And I wonder what he might have felt when Indians on the internet whizzed around this photograph last summer when British Prime Minister David Cameron was driving off to Buckingham Palace to reclaim his second mandate in an Indian-owned car, the Jaguar, escorted by police in another Indian-owned vehicle, the Land Rover. Kind of sends a post-colonial frisson from some of us. Anyway, the point is that it is time to set aside the stereotypes of who can and cannot excel at what in our globalizing world. A generation ago, everything, the tallest, the biggest, the best, the smartest, was either by or in the United States. Today, that is no longer the case. Except the smartest, of course, they're all in this room. You know, the Swissest executive jets are made by Empire in Brazil. The tallest building in the world is currently in Dubai, which overtook the previous tallest building in Taipei, which in turn supplanted one in Malaysia. I'm afraid the lovely Freedom Tower doesn't quite make it to the top three. The world's biggest plane is being built in Russia and Ukraine. The Challenger to the Panama Canal, cutting through Nicaragua, is being built by China. The biggest shopping mall in the world is in Beijing. The country with the highest per capita income is not the United States, but Singapore, which also has the world's biggest Ferris wheel. Now, 30 years ago, all these categories would have probably been headed by the would have been headed by the United States. The US does remain the world's sole superpower, but others are catching up fast in various areas where it alone had been dominant. It's not so much, of course, the decline of the West as the rise of the rest. Growth projections for the original BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, indicate they will collectively match the original G7 share of global GDP by 2050, if not by 2040, as the earlier predictions had it. An example that comes to me in front of this largely Indian audience is that a couple of decades ago, no one would have mentioned India and high technology in the same breath. The migration to America of a number of Indian engineers from the 1960s onwards helped create a new perception of India amongst those with whom they worked. The engineers had a solid grounding in their field, and they excelled at the freedom afforded to them in the US. So an Indian invented the Pentium chip, another Indian invented Hotmail, a third started or co-started Sun Microsystems, and Indians have been involved in some 40% of all the startups in Silicon Valley. Over time, the Indianness of engineers and software developers began to be taken as synonymous with mathematical and scientific excellence. Today, at least in this particular field, Americans speak of the IITs, the Indian Institutes of Technology, with the same reverence they only used to accord to MIT. And that is significant because when I came to this country as a graduate student back in 1975, believe me, the image of India here consisted essentially of naked fakirs lying on beds of nails, snake charmers doing the Indian rope trick, and possibly, in a generous mood, Maharajas sitting on caparisoned elephants. And that was about it. Today, that image has been replaced by India as this land that produces engineers and computer experts by the bucket load. You know, every Indian is seen as a software guru or a computer geek, and this can have terribly unintended consequences. A friend of mine who, like me, I think it majored in history, was accosted by an anxiously perspiring white guy at a European airport, saying, you're Indian, can you help me fix my laptop?" So, but the stereotype has changed and changed in ways that we might not have been able to imagine, certainly a generation ago. There are seats, for those of you still standing there, a couple of seats in the front, some here, etc. In case you, because I'm only on point 4 now. So So fourth, and each of these points sort of almost incorporates an implicit but in it, the new millennium is a time for diversity. In 1996, Professor Samuel Huntington looked at the globalizing world emerging from the end of the Cold War and predicted a clash of civilizations. He was wrong. Civilizations are not monoliths. Each of the civilizations he analyzed had a great deal of diversity within it. And religion and culture are merely amongst the many variables that govern the actions and policies of states. Very often states which have a religion in common, they have other differences amongst them. Take, for example, the contrasting positions held by different Islamic states over the Taliban rule in Afghanistan, where Pakistan was essentially sponsoring the Taliban government in Kabul, and Iran was bitterly opposing it, and both are Islamic republics. So you can see that religion alone does not explain the behavior of states, and I don't think Huntington had it right. But you young people, as the leaders of tomorrow, will have to learn both how to live with change in a varied world, and also how to live with contradictions. To take another example, whenever I make speeches about India, I often joke that anything I can tell you about India, the opposite is also true. We like to think of ourselves as an ancient civilization, but we're also a young republic. Our IT experts are leading India confidently into the second half of the second decade of the 21st century, but the majority of our population still lives in each of the other 20 centuries. But the interesting point is that quite often these opposites coexist quite cheerfully. One of my favorite images of India, for example, again, is something that went around the internet, so many of you may have seen it. It's from the last Kumbh Mela but one, and it's a photograph of a naked Hindu holy man, a sadhu, right out of Hollywood central casting, right? Bare torso, ash-smeared bony chest, wispy beard, matted hair, water on his face, broken teeth, you name it. The guy, and he's staring away into the distance. What one might have imagined at one time would be this cliched picture of timeless otherworldliness. But in this photograph, this same naked sadhu, this Hindu holy man, is chatting away on a mobile phone. And I think what's important is that though you may see this in some ways as a cliche trope, you are all functioning in a world in which a naked sadhu can chat away on a cell phone, and you need to learn to embrace the possibilities and the complications that this represents. One of the paradoxes of our globalizing world is that if the 20th century, in that famous phrase from the First World War, has made the world safe for democracy, then the challenge of the 21st is to make the world safe for diversity. The world as a whole must reflect the idea that is already familiar to multi-ethnic democracies like India and America, that it shouldn't matter what the color of your skin is, the kind of food you eat, the sounds you make when you speak, the kind of God you worship, or not, if you choose to, so long as you want to play by the same rules as everybody else and dream the same dreams. It is not essential in a democratic India or America to agree all the time, so long as you will agree on the ground rules of how you will disagree. In fact, the American author Benjamin Barber has written of the twin prospects facing the world as that of jihad versus Macworld. Jihad, in the name of 100 narrowly conceived fates, I'm quoting here, against technology, against pop culture, against integrated markets, against modernity itself, unquote, versus a Macworld of globalization run rampant, a world of, and I quote, fast music, fast computers, fast cars and fast food, with MTV, Macintosh and McDonald's pressing nations into one commercially homogeneous theme park, unquote. Now what's interesting, and you don't have to agree with any of these tropes, is that both jihad and Macworld end up by obliterating our most precious possession, the sense of what makes us special, our distinctive individual identities. We need to strive for a world in which we can preserve our individual identities and yet work in cooperation with each other. The only solution is to fight for diversity. Fifth, the new networked world is seeing the rise of old problems. We think of religious wars and crusades as relics of medieval history, yet they have come back to haunt us in the second decade of the 21st century, especially with ISIS/Daesh. Why are so many political grievances, real or imagined, articulated in religious terms? The only possible answer surely lies in the primordial nature of religious identity. As a writer, I'm attracted to what one might call the cultural construct of identity, of which religion is only a part and perhaps not even necessarily the most important part. But when other avenues of identity mobilization are restricted in autocratic states, and you can each pick an example where the avenues of mobilizing identity are indeed restricted, or when they're difficult, as in societies where political patterns are entrenched and admit few interlopers, then ordinary people tend to fall back upon the one identity that seems basic to them, and that tends to be religion. Professor Amartya Sen has written very meaningfully about identity, and he's argued that every one of us has multiple identities. So let's say he's a Hindu, he's a Bengali, he's an Oxbridge Don, he's a Harvard professor, he's a philosopher, he's an economist, he's a Nobel winner, he's a left of center crusader for certain causes, he's an education. Well, each of these labels can be applied to him, and they each mean more or less at different times in different contexts. Now, he would say that each of these is equally important. But I have to recognize that secular intellectuals like him, or for that matter myself, might like to claim that us being a cricket fan or a US graduate student or whatever is as important an identity for us as that of being born in a Hindu family. But I have to admit that we are in a very small minority if we say that for most of the world, religion tends to mean more than that and more than other identities, and it would be unwise indeed for us to ignore the clarion call of religious fanaticism that has now seized so many desperate young men and even a few women around the world. We see that these problems are being reflected even in a country like India. Now, of course, there can be something precious and valuable about religion, about having a faith that allows a human being to see himself or herself and one with others stretching their hands out towards God around the world. But can we separate religion from politics? Can we dream of a world in which religion has an honored place, but where the need for spirituality will no longer be associated with the need to belong? Where religion will not be the principal unit of identity, and identity not the principal driver of politics. If identity can relate principally to citizenship rather than faith, to a land rather than a doctrine, to geography, if you like, rather than religion, if that identity is one that can therefore live in harmony with other identities, then we might be able to resist both jihad in that world. If we all come to understand and accept that every one of us has many identities, and that we can assert each of them without necessarily attacking others, that I am safe in my identities if I let you be safe in yours, that surely is the only recipe possible for global coexistence. Sixth, the old binaries of the Cold War era are no longer relevant. There are, for example, from the point of view of a country like India, no longer two superpowers to be non-aligned between. Instead, the metaphor for today's globalized world is really that of the World Wide Web. In this increasingly networked world I've been trying to describe to you, we are, as on the internet, going to have to work through multiple networks. Those networks will sometimes overlap with each other, with common relationships amongst the countries that are networking with each other. Sometimes they will be distinct, sometimes there will be partial overlaps and not in other cases, and they'll all serve our interests in different ways and for different purposes. Let me illustrate what this means with a simple example. Our foreign minister of India, meets annually with her counterparts from Russia and China in something called RIC. Then she adds the Brazilians and the South Africans, and they meet together in something called BRICS. Then she takes out the Russians and the Russians and the Chinese, and she meets with Brazil and South Africa in something called IPSA, for South-South cooperation. And then to that she adds the Chinese, but not the Russians, in a grouping called BASIC, for environmental negotiations. And India is the only country that belongs to all of these groupings, and not merely because its name conveniently begins with that indispensable element in every acronym of power, but because, of course, it actually has a useful role to play in each of these forums, and it actually contributes meaningfully to each of these forums. And this kind of World Wide Web style networking on the global plane is widespread. I mean, I can again take an Indian example. You are, after all, leading up to a South Asian conference. And that is that India is simultaneously a leading member of the United Nations and even aspiring for a permanent seat in the Security Council, but it's also the animating spirit behind the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, with just its 7 neighbors. 193 countries in the UN, just its 7 neighbors here in SAARC, the South Asian Association. Or it is a leading voice of the G77, the global trade union of developing countries. But it's also a leading voice of the G20, the management of the global macroeconomy. Or it's still a voice of the non-aligned movement, which reflects its colonial, post-colonial history, where it gets a chance to let off some steam against the Western colonial powers around the world, but then it's also a leading light of the community of democracies alongside the very Western countries that it's railing against in the non-aligned movement. Now, all of this may seem contradictory, but it really isn't. We have the great ability to be in these institutional networks, pursuing different objectives with different partners, and in each finding a valid purpose that suits us. That's the networked world of today that I would describe to you. And when I was minister very briefly in the foreign ministry, I somewhat rashly suggested that we were perhaps moving beyond non-alignment to something that I dubbed multi-alignment. Phrase never caught on, so put it away. Well, all of you young people will know, of course, that in the 21st century you're going to spend your adult lives interacting with people who don't look, sound, dress, or eat like you, and that's already happened to you here in Bana, I'm sure. But for a country like India, imagine the same young people whose parents would have worked in this protected environment, this closed economy, suddenly finding themselves routinely working for internationally oriented companies, because every company is now internationally oriented, clients, colleagues, consumers, customers, all from other countries around the world, now taking their holidays in far-flung destinations, whereas in the old days you just couldn't afford to travel out of India. It was seen as an impossible dream to have a foreign destination on your itinerary. And of course, all of you are growing up and have grown up into a world that's full of such opportunities. But along with these opportunities, you also find yourself vulnerable to threats from beyond your borders. Terrorism, of course, but not just that. Transnational crime syndicates, counterfeiters of currency, drug smugglers, child traffickers, internet spammers, credit card crooks, and even imported illnesses like now the Zika virus. All of these talk about the dangers of a more interconnected world as much. Now, wouldn't you want your government, whichever government it is, to devise policies to deal with such challenges that will affect your future? Should such policies in an ever more interdependent world even be called foreign policies? One of the reasons that foreign policy matters today is that foreign policy is no longer merely foreign, it affects you right here where you live. All of us should want our governments to seize the opportunities that the 21st century world provides, while managing the risks and protecting you from the threats that this world has also opened you up to. So the distinction between domestic and international is less and less meaningful in today's world, because one is tied to the other far more closely than it might appear on the surface. The effects of the China market distortion, for example, have been felt in economies right around the world, and certainly in India too. In India, the value of the rupee has dropped, economic policies have been affected by what's going on in China. But generally speaking, oil price decisions made thousands of kilometers away have affected the fortunes of state governments in India. And that's the sort of international economic connectedness in the era of globalization that no one can get away from anymore. Seventh, all of the foregoing, everything I've told you so far, involves obliging some of us to work for change. The dominance of a handful of small industrialized Western countries, especially in the international financial institutions, the so-called Bretton Woods organizations, looks increasingly anomalous in a world where economic dynamism has shifted irresistibly from the West to the East. With all of this and the emergence of new countries, new powers and forces, which unlike China were omitted from the high table in 1945, the world has clearly reached a point where there is need for a system redesign of global governance to ensure that all countries can participate in running the world in a manner commensurate with their capacity. Fact is, in international affairs, you're either at the table or you're on the menu. And for a country like India, and more countries in many other parts of the world that are emerging, rising, whatever adjective you want for them, they've had enough of being on the menu and are clamoring for a seat at the table. A country like India for a long time has been a rule taker in the international system and now feels ready to participate as well in being a rule maker. It has the capacity, the experience, the human resources, the track record, the technology to play a major role, for example, in helping manage the global commons on everything from cyberspace to outer space. Why shouldn't it? Why would you not want it? So this means that we need to redistribute power, not only in the UN Security Council, which is a well-known example to many of you, but also in the international financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, the Bretton Woods institutions. The new development bank of the BRICS, for example, which has been set up in Shanghai with an Indian private sector banker as president, is undoubtedly going to grow as an alternative to the West-dominated World Bank. I'm sorry, I mean, it's just going to happen that way. And as for the political organs of global governance, it's simply not reasonable to run the world's premier international system and of course, the Security Council is the principal organ for peace and security, and you can't do it on the basis of the geopolitical realities of 1945 here in 2016. The 5 permanent members of the Security Council, for example, still enjoy their positions and their right of veto because they happen to have won a war 20 years ago. It's difficult, what am I saying, 70 years ago. So it's difficult to justify any arrangement in the 21st century on the basis of an event of history 7 decades in the past. And that's essentially what we're being expected to swallow. And then when you look at the Chinese-driven new financial institution, it's very much a case of them saying, don't give us a level playing field, we'll go off and build our own playing field. And that's something that I think the rest of the world needs to really think about and worry about. 8th, the mass media is vital for tomorrow's leaders, but it's not enough. Now, you all know growing up in the information era that you can't hope to succeed in the 21st century without the mass media, both to know what's going on and what's in the minds of people, and also to project your own views and concerns them in your blogs, your tweets, your Facebook posting. But again, it's not new. It goes back before the internet era. I mean, any doubt that I might have had about the reach and influence of global mass communications goes back to the advent of satellite TV. I was in St. Petersburg, Russia, for a conference once, and I remember being approached in the parking lot by a Tibetan Buddhist monk in his robes, thumping his cymbals and chanting, who paused in his chanting to say, "I've seen you on BBC." So that's the kind of world we're all in. Of course, the internet has accentuated this 100-fold. But do not forget that the global mass media still reflects principally the interests of its producers. What passes for international culture is usually the culture of the economically developed world. Yes, there's the occasional third world voice, that it speaks the first world language. And that too is not a new insight. 5 decades ago, at the time of the first Congo Civil War, journalist Edward Baer wrote a famous anecdote about a television newsman he saw in a camp of violated Belgian nuns, going around with his camera and microphone saying, "Anybody here been raped and speak English?" In other words, it wasn't enough to have suffered. You had to have suffered and be able to articulate your suffering in the language acceptable to the journalist. Now that's fundamentally still true. Now that leads to the obvious corollary question, can the internet compensate? Would the internet turn out to be a more effective tool for democratization? In the West, sure, it already has, in so many ways, made information far more accessible than it ever was before. Internet access in the US is, what, about 92%. In a country like India, though, it's still 15%. So it's not yet true in the developing world. The stark reality of the internet today is still the digital divide. You can tell the rich from the poor by their internet connections. The gap between the technological haves and have-nots exists, it's real, we have to admit it's there, and that in many cases it's widening both between countries and within them. Because the information revolution, unlike the French Revolution, is a revolution with a lot of liberté, some fraternité, and no égalité. So the poverty line is not the only line about which leaders with a conscience, which I hope all of you will turn out to be, must think. There's also the high-speed digital line, the fiber optic line, all the lines that connect us, but which in connecting us exclude all those who are actually not plugged in to the possibilities of our brave new world. The key to the internet divide still remains the keyboard. Those who do not have one risk marginalization, and you as tomorrow's leaders cannot afford to forget them. If you recognize both the limitations and the potential of today's information era, the 21st century could yet become a time of mutual understanding such as we've never seen before. A world in which it's easier than ever before to meet strangers must also become a world in which it's easier than ever before to see strangers as no different from ourselves. I still remember when I was your age or younger, there used to be this thing called the pen pal system, where people, young teenagers around the world, would give their addresses and their hobbies and a 2-sentence capsule summary about themselves, were printed in pen pal announcements in various magazines. And then people would pick a pen pal whose interests seemed to correspond to their own, and they'd go off and buy an aerogram and write painstakingly a letter, to this unknown person in this unimaginable country, and stick a stamp on it and send it off, and it took 2 weeks to get to the destination, and you waited 2 more weeks for the reply to make its way back to you, and the excitement of seeing this letter with the foreign stamps, this connection to this strange person you might never meet half a world away. And today, all of this is possible in a few seconds with a click of the mouse. And that is the great thing about the internet revolution. But at the same time, it also fragments in many ways, right? So in the old days in America, for example, when I first came to this country, there were basically 3 channels that everybody had to tune into at the same time to get the news. One of the anchors even said, "That's the way it is," at the end of the news broadcast. Today, there are such a multiplicity of sources of information that people no longer have the same frame of reference. If you're interested in what's going on in a country that is not selling America vast quantities of oil or threatening it with terrorists, you'll probably never see it in any of the main news broadcasts. But you would find some obscure channel or some internet site that'll give you as much information as you want, but that you already have to be interested in it to find it. So how on earth do you actually get information across to people who ought to have it but don't care enough to get it? And these are questions to which there really is no simple answer that I leave you with. 9th and finally, here I am at Barnard College, Columbia University. Each of you here has a role to play in ensuring that ours can be a better world, that ours will be a better world for us having been in it. I believe that as citizens of this new networked world we've been talking about, we have a responsibility to think about those who are not as fortunate as us, amongst our own colleagues, but also around the world. I've had the rare privilege as a young man, in fact, perhaps younger than some of you in this audience, of working for those who've lost everything, the world's refugees. Because when I was in my early 20s, I was running the UN's program for the Vietnamese boat people rescued at sea and brought into the port of Singapore. And I can tell you lots of stories about that, but I'll never forget one family who had left Vietnam in a tiny boat. They'd cannibalized a tractor engine to power it, but sure enough the engine broke down in a day or so into the journey, and they ran out of food, and they ran out of drinking water. The boat was just drifting aimlessly on the South China Sea, and they were subsisting on rainwater and hope. But they had two small children with them, an infant and a baby just a few weeks old. And obviously the baby and the infant could not survive on rainwater. They were too young to know the meaning of hope. So what did the parents do? They slit their fingers and made the babies suck their blood as the only available source of nourishment to survive. It kept them alive. But when they were rescued, as it happens by an American ship, they were so feeble they couldn't even stand. The parents and the children, of course, were at death's door. And when the ship came into port, my staff and I broke every rule in the book to rush them to intensive care, and we were proud to have been able to save their lives. And then to see that same family a few months later, healthy, well-fed, well-dressed, and embarking on new lives in the US, offered the kind of satisfaction that few jobs do. But it taught me that, honestly, any one of us can have that the satisfaction of being able to put your head to the pillow at night, knowing the things you've done during the day have made a difference to real human beings, to the lives of people, ideally people you can see and meet and touch, but sometimes not. It doesn't matter. The main thing is you've done something that has touched a life and that has changed somebody's fortunes. I believe that is a privilege each of you can enjoy, whatever you do, in whatever profession you take on after university. And that's the spirit in which I'd like to see young leaders come out of this university. Now, we're all like Egyptian mummies, we're strapped for time. I do want to leave enough time for a meaningful exchange of questions and answers, as I said, not just of what I've said to you, but on what I might not have said to you. So let me pull my strands together. My basic point is that we have to think beyond the old cliches of world leadership or the Cold War or global domination or whatever, to cooperative relationships in a networked and diverse world. Sovereign nation states will continue proudly to guard their sovereignty. Of that I have no doubt. But the world will inevitably push them together in ways that transforms the very definition of the word sovereignty and dilutes its meaning. The ultimate purpose, after all, of any country's foreign policy is to ensure the security and well-being of its citizens. The old autarkic ways of doing this will no longer suffice. You simply have to work in cooperation with others to get things done for your own people. Most of us belong to countries that proudly and somewhat chauvinistically perhaps proclaim our Independence Day. Fair enough, I'm no exception. I proudly wear the Indian flag with my lapel. But the time may come when we realize that what we really ought to be celebrating the rest of the time is something else. The recognition that every other day on the calendar in our globalized world is really an Interdependence Day. Thank you very much. I hope that... will all effectively contribute to this globalized and networked world, and I look forward to taking your questions or comments. Is somebody going to volunteer to come up here and play traffic cop, or am I going to have to recognize the president? I need to come. Do you want me to sit there and grab a mic?
Whatever you prefer.
No,
Just the mic for the camera.
That's the mic for the camera.
That would help you.
Do you want to use this one?
There's this one too. Maybe this works. Try this. Otherwise, I can stay here. Yeah.
Okay.
And the other one here, and there's this one here.
The one in your lap, so I'll use the hand.
No, this one is also for a TV camera.
We'll just use that. And if you want to answer questions.
Sure. Is this working? Is this working? Okay, so I'll stay here. Punish my knees for a little longer. All right, so Anish, you pick the questioners, and please do identify yourselves. Tell me who you are, what you're doing, so I get a clue to where you're coming from, as it were, intellectually as well. Right.
There we go. Now, before we start off, I had one quick question. I was going to ask her. When we put out news for this event, a lot of people who did not know if you asked me, who is Shashi Tharoor? And given the context of the talk that you've given on globalization, I want to ask you that question itself. Which Shashi Tharoor are we talking to today? Because the one I interacted with 2 years ago was the author of Nehru and Invention of India. There's also another Shashi Tharoor who is the diplomat. There is another Shashi Tharoor who is the politician in India. And there is yet another Shashi Tharoor who played Anthony to our very own Meera Nair's Cleopatra in St. Stephen's Day. So which Shashi Tharoor are we talking about? And what do you think of as the globalized citizen?
Well, I guess I could have tried to give you a jokey answer to that, but I won't. Look, I'm a human being with a number of interests and concerns about the world, some of which manifest themselves in the different kinds of work I've done and do, and some of which manifest themselves in my writing. I mean, it's a luxury, I suppose, in some ways. Academics live in a world of conclusions, and others live in a world of decisions, the men of action, as they'd like to think of themselves. But what's particularly interesting and challenging sometimes is to be both, or to try to enjoy the luxury of both performing certain useful actions and thinking about them and writing about them and observing them while you're so doing, and I've tried to do that. Maybe in the process I've spread myself too thin, that's quite possibly the case. But I'd like to see myself as somebody who's intimately involved in many of the global issues that I like talking about, but instead of just being involved in doing things in them, I'd like to think about them, analyze them, and describe them as well while working in that area. And that's where this speech has come from, as it were. It's from both a direct involvement in the practice of international relations and foreign policy, and some interest in thinking and writing about it from the outside.
Thank you so much. I won't ask any more, and I will open this up. First one right here. I do not think that's what it's going to happen.
Okay, so I can scream. I'm a junior here at New York University, and you spoke a lot about the emergence of India. The harsh reality is there's still 275 million people that are below the poverty line. There are around that same number, 250 million people that are illiterate. My question isn't on the basis of that, but recently, in the past 6 months, 3 BJP-led states have passed a bill that have amended the Panchayati Raj institution, right? So they've created stipulations. One of them is you have to be a 10th grader or an 8th grader or a 6th grader according to if you're a male or female and what caste you belong to. Other than that, there are other stipulations. I ask you this because I respect you enough that you won't bring your political ideologies in here, but as the Shashi Tharoor that you are, what's your analysis of the repercussions, of positive or negative, of this bill? Because it sounds fantastic in paper, but the repercussions on grassroots, what do you think of it?
I think it's wrong. I actually think that the point about democracy is that it's representative. And if it so happens you have a lot of illiterate people amongst your voters, then it's only fair that they should have a chance of also representing themselves in your democracy. So to suddenly impose an education qualification is just as bad as the bad old days when you had to have a property qualification or an income qualification or a gender qualification or whatever else. I mean, now it's time for us to wake up and say this is actually wrong. It's a way of restricting the franchise and narrowing the scope and impact of our democracy rather than some virtuous attempt to improve the quality of political leadership, which is the way the BJP states are trying to portray it. I would say very strongly that we should work to get those laws overturned. And they could conceivably still be challenged, though I understand that a court in one state has already ruled that the law can be upheld, that it's not inherently discriminatory. I find that logic somewhat bizarre, because, you know, when Bill Clinton said, for example, that his cabinet must look like America, and so he had, you know, blacks and Hispanics and women and men and all of the stuff, and that was the argument, that in order to be more democratic, you had to represent the country's diversity. Well, if you suddenly tell people that unless you've passed at least the 10th grade, you can't contest an election, even if you're actually seeking the votes of a lot of other people who, like you, haven't passed the 10th grade, then you're being unfair to those people and depriving them of a chance to be represented by somebody who empathizes with and understands their problems. So, I'm against it.
Going forward, I think globalization hasn't worked for us very well, so we haven't done a mic check and this one isn't working. So I'm going to leave it up to you to select people.
Now you select the people and I'll answer the questions.
So leaving that job up to me. In the third row, right there. You in the green.
He's colorblind.
The second row, yes, you.
Hi, my name is Yuvraj. I'm originally from Amritsar, currently a strategy consultant and inspiring policymaker. I've followed you for a long time, and I really admire you for your meticulous work in like social political reforms, and especially furthering the cause of scholarship into politics, you know, as envisioned by Plato. My question is that, what is next for you in the coming few years? Can we get excited for Shashi Tharoor as the Prime Minister?
Oh. Thank you. Well, I mean,
I would like to see that happen.
there's a wonderful Jewish expression, right, from your lips to God's ears. God will have to have 1.2 billion years for this to be realistic. No, I mean, look, our system being the way it is, you never quite start off aspiring. It's not like, you know, every American thinks he can run for president, and these days it really looks as if. You know, the truth is that in India it's a parliamentary system, another perfidious British legacy, right? So we're stuck with it, where parties get to choose the leaders who will eventually then serve as Prime Minister. And so essentially in our system, I think the pool for potential Prime Ministers is very much smaller, especially since unlike in other democracies, there isn't any frequent churning at the top of the leaderships of these parties. They're all, and I mean all, because there's some who tend, when they look at this, to simply point their finger at my party, but in fact, look at any political party in India, with perhaps one or two mildly honourable exceptions, and really political leadership only changes after a funeral pyre is lit. People tend essentially to carry on leading the political parties, and so I will not suggest, I think it would be irresponsible of me to suggest that having personal ambitions of that nature makes any sense at all. What I will say though is that one can make a useful difference in many ways, and I'm trying to do that. As an opposition member of Parliament, I'm freer, for example, to come up with private members' bills that can try and push the national conversation in certain directions. I've just done so with a few bills and talk about them if anyone's interested. And I intend to continue doing that, taking up issues that haven't otherwise been pushed by government, either the present government or the previous ones. You can, of course, also contribute to the national conversation through the mass media, though our television has now become such an utter disgrace. Every channel is worse than Fox News, so it's very difficult to actually feel that it's worth appearing on. I shouldn't say every channel, there are a few honorable exceptions, but most are looking up to that model. You can also write. The internet is turning out to be a very welcome refuge for the likes of me, so I don't have to actually go and submit myself to appearing alongside editorial policies I fundamentally disagree with, by just simply publishing things on the net that people can read. And then, of course, there is the process of hoping that through governance you can bring about change. To that, in our parliamentary system, you've got to be in government. And at the moment, my party has been decimated in the last elections. We're down to 44 seats. I can't I can't say that we are in a powerful way able to affect things. As long as we have the numbers we have in the upper house, in the Rajya Sabha, we are able not so much to get things done, but to prevent things that are wrong from happening. And that, I think, is a power that we're using. Of course, it's very easy to caricature that as pure obstructionism, but very often it's the only effective way you can use to prevent change that's undesirable or that's negative from taking place. So all of those things I'll do, and then we'll see what the future holds. I mean, the voters might decide to return me to the world of literature. That would be an option.
Could we have the person in the pink shirt right back there?
Okay, and then we should have some gender balance in it.
Yes.
Go ahead.
In the pink shirt.
Alright. My name is Ravi. I'm an MBA student at Columbia,
Hi.
and like someone mentioned, an aspiring policymaker if possible.
Great.
I read somewhere about colonial hangovers related to this topic and relation to the earlier question as well. It's been almost 67 years since independence, but we still see many parties. You mentioned your party, definitely other parties as well. I don't know.
68 and a half, that's okay.
Yeah. So wherein there is one family or group of families leading them. And you see when the leader is getting old, even the supporters of the party always claim or always want the son or the daughter to take over. Which I think is sort of colonial mentality, still want the Raja, Maharaja or Maharani to be there. I want to know your opinions on, can we change this? How can we bring about this change? Do you think this would change? And if yes, what's the timeline you're looking forward? Because I think this goes to the top wherein now there is a feeling of Raja and the other Raja, so if there is one person there, the other person doesn't want to cooperate because he dethroned them.
No, well said. You know, the truth is that this is a problem in our culture, and it's deeply endemic in our culture. And it's not just in politics. After all, we're a country where the sons of Bollywood stars become Bollywood stars, and the sons of cricketers are playing cricket more and more, and so on and so forth. But even more so, I mean, dentists, ophthalmologists, doctors, everybody. I mean, I actually inaugurated the All India Ophthalmologists Association convention, and the president was proudly telling me how his son had just qualified. And so, you know, he now knew who was going to inherit his practice. I mean, this is how the caste system came about, for God's sake. It's the transmission of all skills, talents, and professions through the gene pool is the way in which we worked. And I think it's difficult to explain why that should be so, because many other societies evolve very differently. But in our case, it is strongly entrenched. There's a presumption that people will do what their parents would do. And so, for example, if you want to be a cobbler or a carpenter, you better have an uncle or a father who was a cobbler or a carpenter, because nobody else is going to teach you. And that too prevents this kind of transformation. In the world of politics, what do you do? I mean, increasingly, one's hope lies in, and I somewhat optimistically, perhaps idealistically, perhaps naively, predicted some years ago a gradual, or at least I persuaded myself, I'd seen a discernible shift from the politics of identity to the politics of performance. I mean, I could give examples of that. Many of you know how Lala Prasad Yadav ran a couple of times, essentially just saying to the voters, isn't it time that people like us were in power? Let's kick those Brahmins around a bit. And what? Well, the third time he tried that, the message came back to, where's our Bijli Sadak Pani? Where's our electricity, our roads, our drinking water? Of course, a generation earlier would have been Roti Kapra and Makan. You know, where's our bread, our clothes, our shelter? And the next time around, it might be, where's our airports and our internet connections and our broadband? Yeah, it could be all of that. But the fact is that there are now expectations, and politicians are being judged by those expectations, and votes are being cast on the basis of performance more and more. And in fact, it's one of the curious things about the BJP is that they seem to unlearn the lesson, because Mr. Modi won the election in 2014 on a campaign promising performance and talking about Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, and so on. They come to power and try to fight every subsequent by-election or state election on the politics of identity, polarizing votes on religious grounds. It's quite bizarre that having succeeded with one tactic, they go ahead and try the very tactic that they had abandoned, and they continually fail, and they never seem to learn. But our politicians obviously don't all have PhDs.
And now, as promised to the lady in the pink, I'm just going to hand a mic around so I'm not calling out in random. Right.
Hi,
The mic doesn't work, so just assume it's a talk. I remember Kofi Annan telling me that in Ghana, when they had these village gatherings of all the elders sitting and discussing problems, there was something called the talking stick. And you could only speak when the talking stick was handed to you, otherwise if you were speaking out of turn, you were punished. So think of that mic as your talking stick. You can hold it as a symbol of your right to speak, but you can't speak into it.
I'm a junior studying at Columbia, and you mentioned a lot of globalization. I think we can all agree that climate change is clearly a very global issue. And what do you think India's role should be in climate change, both as a victim and as a perpetrator of climate change?
Yeah, in fact, more a victim, I would argue, than a perpetrator, but certainly victims of its perpetration are Indians themselves, and so we have a very, very strong interest in changing this. What should India's role be? I mean, I would say a couple of things. First of all, that there is a genuine problem that India and other developing countries face in being asked to share the bulk of the onus, because for 150 years the world was polluted and greenhouse gases were generated by the rich developed countries industrializing and transforming themselves. Whereas in India today there are still something like 500 million people who cannot take for granted what every American can, that you turn on the switch on a wall and you're flooded with light. So, you know, when we're lectured a little bit about our responsibility for reducing emissions, and we drive past Columbia University and see every tree lit up with bulbs, one begins to wonder, you know, where the moral high ground is. It's certainly not in the front yards of Columbia University. So I do feel that the Indian position that there is a common but differentiated responsibility for global warming should be respected. Secondly, I would say that India cannot be lumped together with the other big countries. The US, with 5% of the world's population, generates 27% of the world's emissions. China, with 17.5% of the world's population, generates 22% of the emissions. And India, with 17% of the world's population, generates 4%. So there is a difference, and in per capita terms, India remains one of the lowest polluters. So you can't entirely say that India and China, for example, should now bear the same kind of burden as the US. There is a comparison. And clearly the principal sinner remains the US first and the rest of the developed world in its wake. That's on the perpetration front. On the victim front, there's a lot that India needs to do, of course, for its own people. If you were to try and breathe the air in Delhi in December, January, early February, you would understand what I mean, because nature and man have conspired to essentially assault all of us daily. The fog comes down and the smoke rises from the ground, and once it's trapped it becomes smog, and you've got this completely unbreathable polluted air which is creating respiratory illnesses by the day, so much so that a doctor has actually said on the front page of one of our newspapers that if you are a parent of small children, you are irresponsible if you bring them up in Delhi. Move. It's that bad. So when you've got that kind of thing, or when a diplomat friend of mine says at his exit medical, he was asked how many packs of cigarettes he smoked today, and he said he never smoked in his life, and his lungs were those of a habitual smoker, simply from breathing the air in his Indian posting. So these are the kinds of things that we simply have to overcome, and there have been studies saying that our GDP takes a good 1 to 2% hit just from illnesses caused by bad air, unsafe drinking water, toxins in our rivers, and so on. So we are victims, and we are our own victims, and we have a major responsibility to do that. Finally, when it comes to solutions, I do believe that there needs to be much more international cooperation on this. The fact is that there is a lot out here in terms of energy-saving green technologies. But by and large, the rich countries aren't willing to share them with the poor, or at least not share them on an affordable basis. Now, I know the West's argument is, well, these are largely developed in the private sector and we can't tell the private sector what to do. But actually, you can subsidize the private sector in the sense that you can, as governments, make it affordable for poor countries by putting in government subsidies into the cost. So if a private sector technology has to be sold at X, there's no reason why the aid program of the US or Norway or whatever shouldn't make it X less 40% to a developing country that needs it, and that in the process of using it will actually bring down global emissions for everybody by being able to be more friendly. So all of these things are complex and messy, but at the moment India is definitely much more conscientized than it ever used to be to the pollution and environment problem, that particularly schools have become great incubators for awareness of the environment, that change is coming too slowly to help all of us who are breathing that air and drinking that water, but change is coming, and that on the international level India will work responsibly with the rest of the world, but should not, in my view, for the reasons I mentioned, be asked to bear more of a burden than some of the bigger, more guilty for longer countries, which should be doing much more than they are. And I'm looking particularly at the United States when I say this.
With your permission, Dr. Tharoor, can I take 3 questions at a time so that we can have more people asking?
Well, I'll try and give shorter answers, but the problem with that is by the time you ask the third question, I may have forgotten the first one. So let's go one by one.
One at a time. The lady right here.
Hi. So my question to you was, I wrote down, but what do you think is the role of India in the Syrian refugee crisis? And more broadly, should India be hosting refugees fleeing different crises?
Yeah. Well, the answer is it is. It is. One of the private members' bills that I alluded to that I've introduced in Parliament is one that would create a refugee and asylum law in India for the first time. But as I pointed out, in fact, we have in practice a very generous refugee and asylum policy. We just haven't got a legal framework with which to offer it.
Yeah.
So there are some Syrian refugees in India, not a whole lot because it takes a distance from Syria to get there. But we do have some who've come, and we've got some who stayed on after having come as students and so on and went back. But we've actually had some who fled the war and come to India. The thing about India is that a lot of this, in the absence of a coherent policy, means that people have to improvise once they get there. Some get recognized by the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, which has an office in India, and some just disappear into the woodwork or even pretend to be something else in order to get jobs and work and so on. I mean, it's relatively easy for someone from the Middle East to pass as Indian if he can pick up the language, the local language. And some do this. There's been a very interesting, lengthy 2 or 3 page article on this in one of the Indian papers a couple of weeks ago, with detailed interviews with Syrian refugees. If you Google it, you'll probably find it without too much difficulty. And at least one of these young men had simply just was impersonating an Indian and living on in India. He was a Syrian. But there are others who had actually gone to the UN and got themselves recognized as refugees and so on. India has played host, as you know, to the largest refugee crisis in the history of humanity, the 10 million who fled Bangladesh in '71 from the Pakistani genocide. It's also played host to smaller numbers of refugees from Sri Lanka, from Afghanistan, from Iran, and now from Syria and elsewhere. But more significantly, it's also been, perhaps some would say unwittingly, welcoming home to large numbers of migrants who may, but in many cases may not be refugees. During the Nepalese Civil War, it was estimated reliably that 7 million of Nepal's 27 million population were actually living in India during large chunks of the Civil War. There were entire neighborhoods and towns as far away as Pune that had become Nepali neighborhoods. I have been, again, fairly reliably informed that the estimate for the number of Bangladeshi economic migrants who have essentially disappeared into the Indian woodwork, in many cases have acquired false birth certificates and identity documents. But the estimate for Bangladeshi migrants is over 20 million, and some would swear to 30. Now, when you look at those numbers, it boggles the mind. I mean, it outweighs sort of Mexican and Latin American migration to America by far. But the fact is that because India is a large country, 1.2 million people somehow make do. And they come in and unfortunately, because our systems are somewhat lax, there's a thriving cottage industry in false documentation. And so we have lots and lots of people, particularly in West Bengal, who have arrived 3 or 4 years ago and can prove they were born 30 years ago in Calcutta. More babies have been born in West Bengal than the hospitals of West Bengal have ever seen. That's part of what being India is all about. And I can give you a number of anecdotes because I've been taking too long with my answers. I'll cut down. So the short answer is India should do more of what it's doing, but it should do so within a coherent, sensible legal framework, and we need a refugee asylum law.
Thank you.
I'm going to go.
Yeah, keep moving forward. We move sideways. I'm willing to go on as long as time permits for all of you. Yeah.
Okay, I'm Ashwarya. I'm an M&A consultant, and I actually had a two-part.
What consultant? Sorry,
M&A consultant. Yeah, by profession. But a writer by hobby. So, okay, I have a bi-part question for you.
A 5-part?
No, bi-part.
So the merger part and the acquisition.
The first question is for you. We are seeing the Congress is changing over time, and now that you have been out of the power for a little time, and that you have some time to reminisce what it was like.
Busier than I was when I was in government.
My question is, when are we going to see more of Milind Devra and Sindhya and Sachin Pilot? I know Rahul Gandhi's exist, but then I would see more of these people because I really believe these people also have a huge role to play in the future. That is first. My question is about change because I'm more pro-change and we're talking about change. There's the first question about you, what you can do. And the second question is about we people who are Indians who are studying abroad. And when we see that 1 out of every 7 is not represented in UN, what can we as educated people do to change this? So this is how we can change this.
1 out of every 7 people are not
So like
represented in the UN?
for example, if you do not have a power vote on UN, like the Security Council, then 1 of 7 of us are not really represented on the council.
I see. Security. Okay. So on the first question, and by the way, for those of you who aren't familiar with some of these names, every single one of them is a son of a politician. They're however extremely able, bright, well educated. In fact, all of them are also US educated. They're people like you. And so you want to see them playing a bigger role in Indian politics, and let's hope the voters agree, because I do think they would make a very positive difference. One of my arguments when I speak about change in Indian politics is precisely that. Even when there is no apparent change, for example, Patrick French did an analysis pointing out that every single Indian member of parliament under the age of 40 was a dynast, was the son or daughter or nephew or niece of a previous member of parliament or politician. And therefore nothing had changed. In fact, he was wrong simply because though they may have got their breaks because they were from pedigreed political families, they actually represent different kinds of education, thinking and orientation from the conventional political class. So the fact that they're dynasts actually has worked in their favor, because the earlier generation may have been like the conventional politicians that so many educated middle-class Indians profess not to admire, but the younger ones have acquired precisely the education, the sophistication, the cosmopolitanism, the knowledge, and the international sensibility to be the kind of politicians you want to see more of. What will it take? Well, of the 4 you mentioned, Jyotiraditya Scindia is in parliament. Sachin Pilot lost his election, and we, the party, have made him chief of the Congress party in Rajasthan, where he's doing extremely well and is helping revive the party there. Milind Devra lost his election too, and he's writing op-eds and sort of, he's not been entirely idle, and I'm sure that he will No, listen, he's a friend of mine, and he's a terrific jazz guitarist, so I mean, don't. But I was afraid he was going to spend more of his time with his guitar, now that he no longer had to be, standing in the well of the House of Parliament trying to raise slogans against the BJP. But he's writing good, thoughtful op-eds. Who was the fourth name you mentioned? Three you mentioned, all right. Well, one can add to it a few other young politicians who really are reasonably impressive and attractive, and I think can make a difference. So the short answer is parties are certainly recognizing them. The fourth name you mentioned, of course, is Rahul Gandhi, who is extremely effectively sort of leading the Congress revival. He's been energetic, he's charging through the country. Yes. Don't buy into the caricatures of the media, because honestly, I know the guy, he's not the way your reaction suggests he is. And it's because there's been a very effective hatchet job done on it. And if you talk to journalists in India from foreign publications that cover the beat, they're all as astonished as I am as to why this impression exists. Part of the problem, I think, is that there isn't, in keeping with his mother's reticence to the media, just hasn't given enough of himself, so you don't see a well-rounded side. You've seen a few poorly scripted appearances which have perhaps not worked in his favor. But he's thoughtful, he's intellectually curious, he's well-read. He's as well-read as many of you in this room. He retains what he reads, which probably is not true of some of us, and can talk intelligently and intelligibly about these things. He's a smart guy. And I do believe that one very important thing he doesn't believe he has all the answers, unlike somebody who's in power right now. And he believes that he actually will be able to work with smart and talented people on the Congress benches and listen to the public at large to figure out the right answers for the problems that people actually need to see and hear. So I actually would set a great deal of store by the alternative kind of leadership that the Congress Party is projecting.
Let the record state that we did not screen questions.
No, that's fine. And on the Security Council, frankly, there's nothing that individuals as such can do, because ultimately it's going to be a question of policy. So the threshold to amend the Charter is very high. It requires 2/3 of the vote of the General Assembly. 2/3, it basically has to be a formula that is acceptable to 2/3 of the member states, and that is not unacceptable to the 5 permanent members whose powers you want to dilute. That's a summary of a much longer answer, if you like. Obviously, such a formula has so far been elusive, but once one is found and agreed, you don't need the political will on the part of the 5 countries to get it done. But even there, it's a decision that will be made by governments, and not all governments are, shall we say, vulnerable to public opinion, so I can't promise that. Okay, who has a talking stick? Right.
I'm Shauri. I'm a master's student here at Columbia. And as Milton Friedman once said, that the only example that society has transitioned from a poverty-stricken place to progress has been capitalistic society. So in India, when we see this government's policies such as Make in India, Startup India, and so on and so forth, capitalistic policies, one of the biggest problems of capitalism has been income inequality. And so how do you think we should import capitalism into India or make India more liberal so that we already don't add on to the existing great income inequality that exists in India?
Well, you're feeding right into the Congress Party's approach, which is that we believe that, whereas the BJP thinks India is shining, but doesn't really ask who India is shining for, we believe that, yes, you must free the economy, we are the ones who liberalize it. We should put emphasis on growth, because if you don't grow the pie, you've got nothing to distribute. But you must take the revenues of the economy and actually distribute its fruits and proceeds to the people who are otherwise excluded and marginalized. I mean, the magic of the market cannot appeal to those who can't afford to enter the marketplace. So you need, a welfare state is something we perhaps so far still beyond our dreams, because it costs a lot more than the government exchequer can afford. But relief schemes such as, for example, the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, which actually has given us some important transformations. It has increased the purchasing power of the rural poor. It has dramatically